Lecture 5, the social contract. This lecture deals with the state of nature and social contract through the political philosophies and governance procedures developed by Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau. Each author wrote definitive texts at precise historical moments. Thomas Hobbes, Leviathan in 1651, John Locke, Second Treatise on Government, 1690, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, The Social Contract, 1762. Hobbes dealt with issues relating to sovereignty and the English Revolution or Civil War, Locke, the Glorious Revolution, and William and Mary, specifically issues around changing the sovereign and constitutional change, and Rousseau, Enlightenment, freedom, and education. In a state of nature, one is uncertain about what goes on inside the mind of another. So humans necessarily distrust one another. Indeed, my own thoughts tell me that others are deceitful and will threaten me, as I am a threat to them. In this way, it is not that humans lack reason, but they are rational and anticipate danger and make each a potential enemy. Such identifies an existence prior to the society we understand today, and that in a state of nature, conflict was the order of the day, and a social contract was needed to overcome antagonism. However, would a society of perfectly consistent, prudent egotists prevent institutions of mutual insurance? Does this mean that morality arises only from calculated self-interest? There are a number of reasons why one may argue this is impossible. Inconsistency of prudence. No deliberate, decent conduct would be possible. Other human qualities are involved and people act from a sense of justice, friendship, compassion, generosity, etc., i.e. through altruism. Such qualities exist and are respected and honoured by most human societies. Egoists such as Thomas Hobbes, in the Leviathan, 1651, argued that these motives are unreal or empty vessels, that they are used for non-existent motives. However, it is difficult to understand how people have successfully pretended to be moved by them. The question for egoists is how an original society of egoists created and weigh themselves down with rules and regulations that require consideration of others, for others. The continual competition for honour and fear born out of the race for the highest evil is the means by which humanity attains civilization. Fundamentally, the state of nature is a state of war, and not a myth that exists in the distant past, but one that is still with us, an abyss that we thankfully but unwisely forget. In a well-governed state, we live with the solution to such an extent that sometimes we forget that it is the solution, and what it is the solution to. In the state of nature, as Thomas Hobbes put it, life is nasty, brutish and short, and involves the war of all against all. In chapters 14 and 15 of the Leviathan, Hobbes outlines his laws of nature. He thinks that individuals should bring about peace whenever there is any chance of it, that each should lay down the right of self-protection, and each should transfer the right of protection to a third party. The right of nature involves the liberty of each individual to do anything necessary to protect their own life. Jus natural is the liberty each man hath to use his power for the preservation of his own nature, that is to say, of his own life, and consequently of doing anything which in his own judgment and reason he shall conceive to be the aptest means thereunto. Liberty involved the absence of external impediments. However, through reason, people are forbidden to do anything that would bring about their death or detract from the preservation of life. Consequently, because the state of nature, or the condition of man, is a condition of war, of everyone against everyone, where every person has a right to all things, even other individuals, as long as all people have had complete freedom. If every person is allowed to harm all others, then security can never be realized. Consequently, to ensure peaceful cooperation, the subject should give such liberty to the sovereign. However, if other men will not lay down their right, there is no reason for any to divest himself of his liberty. However, to give up one's liberty to hinder another is a reciprocal act which benefits all. To lay down a man's right to do anything is to divest himself of the liberty of hindering another of the benefit of his own right to do the same. See Leviathan and the page and quotes for the page. See Leviathan for the quotes identified here. Only a unified single power can overcome the anarchy of wills and fashion a unity of state or governance. What about safeguards? Then we would need to set up an entity stronger than the state, i.e. a super-sovereign. The sovereign is the regulator of customs, common law, taxation, property and inheritance. All is subsumed under the decision of the sovereign. Indeed, this form of governance embodies autocratic leadership, ruled by the one. Hobbes formulates a contract that does not impose any obligations on the sovereign to the subjects. In the contract, subjects yield up their rights to the sovereign. The contract takes place in the state of nature, where all individuals have a right to all things. Consequently, before the contract, the sovereign, as with everyone else, has the right to nature, to all things. Indeed, it is the subjects that relinquish their rights to all things in favour of the sovereign, because in a state of nature, life is nasty, brutish and short. However, where lands have been conquered, and the contract between subject and sovereign, an agreement is an agreement to allow the conquered to live as long as they obey. If the sovereign considers that the subject has disobeyed, then they can be punished. Subjects have the right to protect their lives, but the sovereign need not respect this right. Fundamentally, the sovereign does not have any obligation toward the subject as individual or in the form of community. The sovereign has been authorized by individuals and the community in general. Consequently, all acts that the sovereign performs have been sanctioned by the community. The only exemption to this involves the right to defend one's own life, which may be exerted in the extreme. However, in an early version of his theory, Hobbes outlines a two-tier contract. Initially, individuals become a community or democratic framework which sanctions a sovereign. Such provides a pre-sovereign political entity which may theoretically act against the sovereign and incorporate a loophole for the inclusion of mechanisms for changing the sovereign. Indeed, such was further exploited by John Locke in his second treatise on government, where he outlines his understanding of the social contract. In the second treatise on government, John Locke argues that humanity should be under no other legislative power than that established by consent, and under no law, rule or regulation than that which the legislator enacted. As with Hobbes, Locke considered that the state of nature, or the state all men are naturally in, that is a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, within the bounds of the law of nature, without asking leave or depending on the nature of any other man. However, for Locke, the state of nature is not like Hobbes, where a war exists among all, because there exists a law to which all are obliged. Reason is the law, and this educates humanity not to harm another in his life, health, liberty and possessions. This is because humanity is defined and constructed equally by God and given similar faculties for sharing in nature, or altruism. When a person does not need to protect themselves, then they should do as much as possible to protect humanity in general. Indeed, all individuals should be restrained from harming one another, and the law of nature be observed, which willeth the peace and preservation of all mankind. However, the law of nature would be in vain if there were nobody in that state of nature had the power to execute that law and thereby preserve the innocent. Indeed, all individuals should be restrained from harming one another. The law of nature should be observed, which willeth the peace and preservation of all mankind. However, the law of nature would be in vain if there were nobody in that state of nature that had the power to execute that law and thereby preserve the innocent. Freedom is curtailed in the social contract to the extent that governance exists in certain areas of public life. In areas that were not governed, then no individual would be subject to the rule of another. By consenting to a sovereign, society rids itself of autocratic leadership and an arbitrary sovereign. Men, being, as has been seen, by nature all free, equal and independent, no one can be put out of his estate and subjected to the political power of another without his own consent. The only way humanity is able to give up natural rights is through developing communities to ensure comfortable, safe and peaceable living. Humanity coming together in peaceful communities provides safety from interlopers or free riders, or the greater security against any that are not members of it. In communities, humanity develops a political society by consenting with others to make one body politic under one government. The individual is obligated to everyone in that society to submit to the determination of the majority. The power that people gave to society can never revert back to each individual. However, if the people have set limits on the legislature, then power residing here may be returned to individuals in general. If people have set limits to the duration of the legislative and made the supreme power in any person or assembly only temporary, or else by the miscarriages of those in authority it is forfeited upon their ruler or the determination of the time set. It reverts back to society or individuals in general, and the people have the right to act supreme and continue the legislative of themselves or erect new forms, or under the old form place it in new hands as they think good. Whenever the legislators endeavour to take away or destroy the property of the people or reduce them to slavery under arbitrary power, they put themselves into a state of war with the people, who are thereupon absolved from any further obedience. These ideas have implications in terms of the American, French and Russian revolutions, where consent was withheld. Locke, however, was more conservative than this, and saw the Glorious Revolution of 1688 as the preservation of English rights, and represented a conservative action rather than the introduction of a new and or better society. In this way, William was called the Great Restorer rather than Innovator. However, Locke forwards a concept of natural rights which determined that any ruler should ensure life, liberty and property. Enforcement of these rights necessitated certain institutions, for example, a representative assembly to authorise taxation and an independent judiciary. Locke attempts to set out the limits of liberty in relation to governance. Man is born free and everywhere in chains. One thinks himself the master of others and still remains a greater slave than they. What can make this legitimate? Each of us puts his person and all his power in common under the supreme direction of the general will, and in our corporate capacity we receive each member as an indivisible part. The contract will defend and protect with force over all the goods of each. However, even though unified, all will still remain free. That is, be told what to do by self alone. Human beings are able to both be ruled and be free if they rule themselves. A person who rules him or herself is one that rules themselves. If individuals are able to govern themselves by retaining the mechanisms by which rules and regulations are made, then they remain free. They are obligated to decisions made by themselves. In this context, they are obligated by moral duty and the compulsion of a morality within each individual. Identify the difficulties that Rousseau puts forward here. How can one give up one's freedom and still remain free? What is the general will? The general will is only actualized when it aims at the common good and is supported by all members with a good will. Even though this may not be the best for them, they accept that it is best for all. It is for the common good. Rather than quantitative, it is a qualitative model ideal and may be represented through common cohesion in times of crisis. It involves the conscience and heart as well as the head. Anything else is perceived as group interest or partial wills, e.g. political parties, interest groups, etc. The general will must emanate from and apply to all, and is distinguishable from the will of all. There is a distinction between the will of all and the general will. The former is the sum total of all particular selfish wills, and the latter is the sovereignty, and it comes from the whole all who are sovereign. In such a situation, sovereignty is indivisible because it reflects the unity of the general will. The sovereign, being formed wholly of the individuals who compose it, neither has nor can have any interest contrary to theirs. Sovereignty is indivisible. It is the will either of the body of people or part of it. In the first case, the will, when declared, is an act of sovereignty and constitutes law. In the second, it is merely a particular will or act of magistracy, dictatorial. The general will is the will of all. Each thinker identifies ideas relating to sovereignty, liberty, consent, and authority. Each is linked to a specific historical era. Hobbes, more autocratic. Locke starts to think in a democratic context. And Rousseau comes from Enlightenment and thinks in a democratic and, if you like, totalitarian context. What I'd like to ask is a question which relates to each of these thinkers, and I'd like you to reflect on the extent to which they correlate with modern forms of governance. And as a side, do you consider that Rousseau's ideas are impractical for modern society?